The Book of Genesis by Robert S. Candlish. 18. The Trial of Faith, its Infirmity. Genesis chapter 16. Quote, Are ye so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are ye now made perfect by the flesh? End quote. Galatians chapter 3, verse 3. Quote, And David said unto God, I am in a great strait. Let us fall now into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hand of man. End quote. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 14. The incidents recorded in this chapter form but a melancholy sequel to the preceding. The juxtaposition is one which an uninspired historian would probably have disguised, and which a mere fabulist would certainly have avoided. It seems strange and sad that immediately after that remarkable scene in which the warrant of Abram's faith and the sufficiency of it are so expressly recorded, in which we find the patriarch so unreservedly reposing in simple and honourable reliance on the divine word, and the Lord, on the other hand, condescending to give him so explicit an assurance of his acceptance, and such sure and infallible tokens for good, the very first circumstance related of him should be his falling into sin, and that the sin of unbelief. But obnoxious as it may be to the cavils of the unreflecting and the ill-disposed, and abused, as perhaps it has been, by not a few of the unlearned and unstable who wrest this, as they do the other scriptures, to their own destruction, the narrative is full of profit. In its origin, nature, and results, this sin of Abram may read us many salutary lessons. 1. It originated at such a time and in such a manner as may well enforce the solemn warning, quote, Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall, end quote, while it painfully illustrates that other affecting saying that, quote, a man's worst foes may be those of his own household, end quote. The patriarch's wife was undoubtedly a godly woman. She is commended as such by the Apostle Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 6, who makes her an example to all Christian matrons. They are her daughters as long as they do well. She, quote, obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, end quote. With him, she came out from among her kindred, and was willing to lead the life of a stranger and pilgrim. During all the time they had spent in the land of Canaan, she was constantly and faithfully with her husband, sharing his trials, and witnessing the great things which the Lord did for him. If, on one occasion, she became too readily a partaker of his sin, when she went into that plan of passing for his sister to which she had well nigh fallen a victim, she then experienced, along with her husband, the vanity and danger of every device of carnal wisdom, while, in the seasonable interposition of God, she received a new proof and pledge of his power to help in the time of need. Nor could the events which followed, marking out the patriarch so unequivocally as the friend of God and the heir of the promise, be lost on his affectionate partner, who herself was heir, together with him, of the grace of life, and by whom his prayers were not wont to be hindered. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. Strange and sad that at such a season, and from such a quarter, temptation should arise, that after a 10 years' walk with God, in the very height of privilege, in the full assurance of faith, the faithful companion of his pilgrimage and helper of his joy should beguile and betray him. After such an instance, who can be secure? In what circumstances, or on what side secure? Well may we lay to heart the warning, quote, Let him who thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall, end quote. 2. The temptation itself is a very plausible one. It bears all the marks of that subtlety which, from of old, has been the characteristic of that old serpent, the devil. Observe the spirit and manner in which the proposal is made by Sarai, and received by Abram. It is plainly such as altogether to preclude the idea of this step being at all analogous to an ordinary instance of sin committed in the indulgence of sensual passion. Most unjustifiable as was the patriarch's conduct, it is not for a moment to be confounded with that of David, for example, whose melancholy fall was caused by the mere unbridled violence of an unlawful appetite. There is no room for the introduction of such an element as this on the occasion of Abram's connection with Hagar. It originated in the suggestion of his faithful wife, and had, for its single object, the fulfillment of the divine promise, whose accomplishment otherwise seemed to be growing every day more manifestly and hopelessly impossible. verses 1 and 2. The ungodly, indeed, who know but one kind of temptation, and that the lowest, may affect hence to indulge in an incredulous smile or sneer. It suits their purpose better to give the narrative an interpretation as gross as their own tastes. Nevertheless, there are temptations of which they have no conception. There are more things in the experience of a spiritual man than are dreamed of in their carnal wisdom. They know not, as he knows them, the wiles of the devil. Upon them Satan finds it enough to bring the coarser and more common inducements of his kingdom to bear, and hence they can but ill imagine the rage to which he is provoked, and the arts to which he is obliged to have recourse, against those who have escaped, or are escaping, from his nets, and who now serve, or are striving with all their might to serve, another master. To these last especially he is compelled to assume the form of an angel of light, and his seduction of them may be expected to be peculiarly artful and refined. So it was in the case of Abram. The patriarch is assailed on the very ground of his spiritual privilege and hope, as one accepted in the sight of God, accounted righteous, pardoned and justified, as one also made an heir of God, declared to be personally invested with a title to a glorious inheritance, and finally, as one sustaining a public character, ordained to be the father of a great nation, the source of blessing to all the families of the earth. In all these particulars, Abram is peculiarly and eminently distinguished, and in respect of them all, he is specially tempted. They are all dependent, let it be remembered, on, quote, one who is to come forth out of his own bowels, end quote. Such is the Lord's express assurance. And still he goes childless. His wife, as she herself represents the matter to him, is barren, and it would seem that she is contented to acknowledge her barrenness as hopeless, and to acquiesce in it as a dispensation of God. She does not speak angrily or impatiently, as Rachel did to Jacob, but meekly and submissively she says, quote, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing, end quote. It is his will, and his will be done. But surely God can never intend that my barrenness should frustrate his purpose, and make void his promise. There must be some way of getting over this difficulty, and reconciling this apparent inconsistency between the promise that to thee a child is to be born, in whom, as the great reconciler, and thy posterity, and all the kindreds of men are to be blessed, and the providence which allots to thee a barren and now aged spouse. There must be some new expedient to be adopted, some other plan to be tried. It may be that Sarai is to be a mother, as it were, by substitute and by proxy, and is to obtain children by her maid, according to the custom already common, of which we have sad enough examples afterward in the family of Jacob. This will accomplish the divine word, and if there be any hesitation about the propriety of the course recommended, may it not be justified by the manners of the age and country sanctioning the usage, by the entire absence of every grosser motive, and by the necessity of the case shutting him up to some such plan? Such was Abram's temptation. Such also, of a similar nature, and indeed so far as regards the difficulty of reconciling sense and faith, substantially identical, was the temptation of Abram's son and Lord, Jesus, in the lonely wilderness, was tempted as the Son of God, with direct and immediate reference throughout, on the part of the tempter, to what the voice of heaven, at his baptism, had declared, quote, if thou be the Son of God, end quote, is the insidious insinuation of the devil, as if he would provoke him by reproach, or persuade him by flattery, quote, if thou be, end quote, or since thou art, quote, the Son of God, end quote. It is an insolent taunt, or a smooth and fawning hint. If thou be, or since thou art, as the voice declared, the Son of God, use thy power for thine own preservation. Appear in thy glory, as advancing in the clouds of heaven. Assume thy universal empire over all the earth. Make the stones into bread, lest thou perish. Cast thyself from the pinnacle of the temple, as coming gloriously in the air, lest the people despise thee as coming humbly on the earth. Take possession of the world's throne, lest the world give thee nothing but the cross. Thus the Lord was tempted in all points, like as Abram was, yet without Abram's sin. To the Lord, therefore, let us look as our example and our strength, that we may be saved. To Abram let us look as, in this instance, a beacon set before us by God for our warning, lest we perish. Especially let us be warned against the two sins which are apt to beset us, in the view of our privilege and our hope as believers, presumption and distrust, which, however opposite, are often found together. For there may be a lurking tendency to practical antinomianism in the heart of him who has tasted and seen that the Lord is good, a sort of feeling as if he were a privileged person, raised above ordinary rules and restrictions, and, in difficult emergencies at least, entitled to judge for himself, to exercise a certain kind of discretion, and to take the matter at issue into his own hands. And along with this, there may be a degree of impatience and distrust, a weariness of waiting for the salvation of the Lord, an undue anxiety, even on the part of him who should be always walking by faith, to, quote, see his signs, end quote, and to have every stumbling block removed. He is in straits, troubled and perplexed, and he casts about for some way of escape. He sees some kind of relief at which he may grasp, some scheme for retrieving the loss he has sustained, some decent form of self-indulgence which may dissipate his despondency and minister to his quiet. May he not avail himself of it? Instead of looking for the deliverance or the good which he needs, as coming at some time still future, he knows not when, and by some means still to be provided, he knows not how, may he not arrive at his end by a shorter and more obvious road? Instead of reckoning, for instance, on the long-deferred fruit of a barren womb, may he not be warranted at last in seeking the desired result by a more natural and usual course? Then comes the insidious thought that, as a child of God peculiarly situated, he may take some slight liberty, and claim a certain exemption and immunity from the strict rule of an exemplary walk. So he begins to walk after the flesh, and too soon he loses the freedom and enlargement of heart which a calm and clear reliance upon heaven inspires, and feels the bitter subjection and enthralment of a renewed dependence upon earthly resources, and a renewed entanglement in earthly policy. 3. Accordingly, the sequel of this part of Abram's history is sufficiently sad. Viewed merely as a domestic scene which might be realized in any ordinary household, how true is it to nature, and how emphatic is the warning which it holds out. The jealousies, the heart-burnings and mutual reproaches which we now find disturbing the peace of this pious family are such as might have been anticipated from the course unhappily pursued, that a woman so strangely and suddenly honoured, taken out of her due place and station, and admitted to the rank and privileges of a spouse, should forget herself and become high-minded, was precisely such conduct as might have been expected on the part of a slave treated as Hagar was, and having a temper unsubdued and a mind uninstructed as Hagar's probably were. She could not enter into the plan which the heads of the house had formed, or into the reasons and motives which led them to form it. To their servant, if not to themselves, it must have been fraught with a most corrupting tendency, and it is no wonder that it proved to her a temptation to insolence and insubordination, stronger than she could withstand. Hence Abram and Sarai had the greater sin, even if they felt that they were at liberty, so far as they themselves were concerned, to do it, and that they were safe in doing it. Were they not bound to ask how it might affect their dependents, whom they made a party in the transaction? Was there not, now that the evil was done and its consequences were beginning to appear, too good cause of regret and repentance? And what of the effect on the godly pair themselves of the error into which they have fallen? Sarai, provoked by the frowardness of Hagar, thought that she did well to be angry. She was loud in her reproaches, and spoke indignantly, quote, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. End quote. Verse 5. Alas, had she forgotten that all that she complained of was but the fruit of her own device, and that as she had sowed, so she reaped? And what is Abram's predicament in so painful a family feud? Has he, too, in part, and for a time, forgotten what is due to the partner of his pilgrimage and the wife of his youth? Is he tempted to carry too far his indulgence towards one who is apparently to realize his anxious longing? And under that natural feeling, has he become less sensitive than otherwise he would have been in regard to her whom he was bound to honour, and more tolerant of insult shown to her? We may almost gather something like this from Sarai's complaint. If it was so, how sad an instance have we here of the difficulty of stopping short when a single doubtful step is once taken. Abram, when he consented to the specious proposal made to him, thought that he was acting disinterestedly and for the best. But other and less worthy motives began to mingle with his better purposes, and at all events he is now entangled in a net of his own making. He is no longer free, he is the slave of circumstances, and he is compelled to make the best he can of a painful perplexity and hard necessity, to do violence to his feelings, perhaps even to his convictions of duty, and to consent to the degradation and disgrace of one whom, after what has passed, he is surely bound to consider as having strong claims upon his regard. In this view, the treatment which Hagar received is all the more unjustifiable. The expressions, indeed, used in our translation give a somewhat exaggerated idea of what she suffered, verse 6. Strictly interpreted, they denote nothing more than that by Abram's command Hagar was again placed, as a servant, under Sarai's rule, and made to render to her obedience such as might be enforced by just discipline. In all the circumstances, a milder and more generous way of dealing with Hagar might have been expected on the part of those who had themselves occasioned her offence, and might have prevented her from incurring greater guilt. Her flight is not excusable in her, but surely it is a sad reproach to the godly family from which she is provoked to fly. 4. In the wilderness the fugitive meets with a better friend. She wanders on in her solitary way, weary of the heat and toil of travel, and half repenting of the hasty step she has taken. At last she sits down beside one of those fountains of water which, with their little spots of freshness around them, form the grateful resting places for the worn and fainting traveller in the desert, as the burning sun beats on his aching head, or the shades of evening invite his exhausted limbs to rest. There, as she meditates at leisure and alone, the excitement of angry strife having passed away, many bitter thoughts crowd upon her mind. The pride which sustained her is gone, and her spirit is mortified and tamed. She cannot now find support in justifying herself and blaming others. Her sin has found her out, and her heart is beginning to yearn towards the home in which she has dwelt so long in peace, and which, for all that had passed, might still, through God's mercy and the mutual forgiveness and forbearance of his erring servants, have proved to her a refuge of holy tranquillity and repose. While feelings like these, perhaps, are swelling her bosom and dimming her eye, a heavenly stranger unexpectedly stands beside her, and a heavenly voice reaches her ear. Trained in the household of one familiar with such divine fellowship, Hagar easily recognizes the angel of the Lord, the being of whose visits she has heard her master speak. Hence she is not dismayed, although the appeal is one that seems only, in the first place, to convince her of her sin. Quote, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou? And then, secondly, to point out to her the utter helplessness of her state. Quote, and whither wilt thou go? Verse 8. Thus the angel remonstrates with her as to the unwarrantable nature of her conduct, reminding her of her duty as Sarai's maid, and causing her to feel how thoroughly she is now at a loss. Nor does Hagar resent the charge, or disguise the straits to which she is reduced. Quote, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai, is her frank acknowledgment, without one plea of self-justification, or any complaint even about her forlorn condition. And it moves the compassion of her heavenly friend. It is the very frame of mind with which he sympathizes, and for which he delights to provide relief. Quote, return, he says, to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands, verse 9, virtually assuring her of a kind and gracious reception, or at least of his own support and favour, should it unhappily be otherwise. And to give her still greater encouragement, he opens up to her the prospect of enlargement and prosperity awaiting the race of which she is to be the mother, the singular race that, with their wild and warlike spirit of jealous independence, standing aloof from the other families of man, are yet to keep their footing among them all, to survive many a convulsion and outride many a sweeping storm, still roaming the same vast plains, fresh and untamed as ever, their fleet steeds scouring the Arabian sands, and their hands grasping the ready spear and flashing sword, unsubdued, unsettled, unchanged, and unchangeable, as it would seem, till the end come. But the prophetical intimation which is connected with this transaction, as well as the allegorical or figurative meaning which the Apostle Paul attaches to Hagar's history, are brought out more fully in the subsequent narrative, and may at present be passed over. Meanwhile, the moral and spiritual lesson with which the incident ends is striking and affecting. Hagar gratefully acknowledges the interposition of God as a very present help in trouble. Quote, she calls the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou, God, seest me. End quote. Quote, thou regardest the low estate of thy handmaiden. End quote. And she dwells on the seasonable and unlooked-for promptness of the help afforded. Quote, have I also here looked after him that seeth me? End quote. Verse 13. Was I looking out for him? Or did his gracious providence surprise me, and his gracious eye almost startle me, when he sought out one, alas, too far gone in hardness of heart ever to have thought of seeking him? Truly may the well be called, quote, the well of him that liveth and seeth me, end quote, of the living God, who looks on my affliction. And justly may the child be named, quote, Ishmael, end quote, as the token that, quote, the Lord will hear, end quote, the cry of the oppressed, and deliver the fainting soul. Verse 11. Nor is the relenting offender slow in obeying the heavenly command. She has been led out into the wilderness, that the Lord might speak comfortably to her. Fleeing from the face of her fellow sinners, who could but rudely aggravate, or, at the best, very slightly heal, the hurt they had themselves inflicted, she fell into the hands of one who could better treat her case. That she was here savingly converted may be considered doubtful, although it is a great thing for her to speak of, quote, him that liveth and seeth her, end quote. At all events, she is to abide a little longer in the household of faith, and to have an interest in the promise and the seal of the covenant. She returns, therefore, to the home she had forsaken, herself softened, and with an experience to tell that may soften her bitterest enemy. But her mistress is not her enemy, although misunderstanding may have arisen, and, alas, may arise again. The meeting may be supposed to be happy, and over the reconciled household, in which the wounds of sin are for the present closed, we may allow the mantle of hope and charity to drop.